I usually
Mm-hmm.
put L2 scaling in quotation marks
Mm-hmm.
because I think I don't think it actually scales the layer one. Like you're not actually scaling the blockchain. So in that
Mm-hmm.
sense, it's a bit of a bait and switch, right? It's like this is the promise: oh, we're going to scale Ethereum or we're going to scale Bitcoin using this technology. But is the use of that technology really one-to-one equivalent in terms of user experience, in terms of trust trade-offs, in terms of all of these other considerations? And I would say absolutely not.
This podcast is sponsored by Coin ATM Radar. When buying crypto with cash, an ATM is much more reliable and safer than meeting some random person in a random place. And unlike an exchange, which could freeze your account, you truly own all the crypto you buy. With Coin ATM Radar, you could find crypto ATMs and other services where you can buy and sell cryptocurrencies for cash. On their website, you can search by coin, address, if the ATM supports selling as well as buying, and you can also search by geo area, country, state, city. You can also check and compare actual current fees at different ATMs. If you want to find out more, head over to coinatmradar.com, which is COINATMRADAR.com. Hey everyone, I have the fantastic pleasure of once again speaking with you, one and only Justin Bonds. How's it going, man?
Doing well. Pleasure to be on your show again, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation. There's a lot to talk about on the subject, and yeah, it's always great chatting with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And the last time we did a show together was on the proof of work versus proof of stake general conversation. And I feel like out of that, we got a good four different podcasts, of which you were at the proof of stake side, to kind of cover the whole issue. So now I feel like I have a great bit of material to direct people towards. And then the scaling thing, it seems like the catalyst for every single thing that people in crypto fight around. The entire argument is decentralization, and the number one thing that brings that conversation out is scaling. And of course, there's so many different ways that this goes. In 2017, there was the block size war. Of course, BTC went the way, and the majority of the market cap of the space, right, went the way of not scaling on the main chain and pushing that to second layers. And it just seems to be sort of accepted that that's the way things went there, but more of like that's what Bitcoin did because Bitcoin has to, whatever. It's a long dead topic, but then when Ethereum started to prioritize L2 scaling, it was much less perceived as a political issue and much more perceived as like this is an actual technical limitation that Ethereum can't do all this stuff without pushing a lot of this onto layer two scaling. And so now here we are, where the vast majority of the crypto market cap is encapsulated in this approach. As far as Bitcoin and those types of chains, I feel like I have a good enough understanding to understand that yes, you can safely scale in a decentralized kind of way, and the L2 solutions such as Lightning Network provided, I don't really like the trade-offs there. I understand that much. But then we start going with, I start reading your threads on X, which everyone should, by the way. It's a great way to kind of get yourself caught up on, the latest debates and everything. And I just see a lot of this like L2 bearishness, but with a lot more detail than something that I could provide as far as these kinds of things. So it seems like while L2 scaling is, or the idea of that is something that's very popular these days, I've noticed that at least you, but also Nikita from Blockchair is another one who I've heard a lot of. There's a few voices that are not just skeptics of this, but seem to think that like L2 scaling as a whole is kind of a scam. So, not to put words in anyone's mouth, but that's why we have you to give stuff in your own
Yeah.
words. So
Yeah.
that's kind of why we're here. So, yeah, anything you'd like to add before we just start
Yeah.
plugging into this greater kind of conversation?
Absolutely. I haven't called L2 scaling a scam for the record. There certainly are scams that use L2 scaling in their name. I think that's something to be seen on a more individual basis. Um, I do talk about L2 scaling when I talk about it on X. I usually put L2 scaling in quotation marks because I think I don't think it actually scales the layer one. Like you're not actually scaling the blockchain. So in that sense, it's a bit of a bait and switch, right? It's like this is the promise: oh, we're going to scale Ethereum or we're going to scale Bitcoin using this technology. But is the use of that technology really one-to-one equivalent in terms of user experience, in terms of trust trade-offs, in terms of all of these other considerations? And I would say absolutely not. And I think that is, a major problem with these layer twos. And this is part of why I've been critical towards this entire idea of layer two scaling, at least in the sense that it replaces the idea of layer one scaling. That's really what I more have a problem with. I'm not against permissionless innovation. I would say go and put out what you want on the free market, right? I think that's something we both wholeheartedly agree with. But I think it becomes a bit more like a parasitical relationship when quote unquote L2 scaling leads to the L1 not scaling. And that to me has just been this repeating pitfall of, I think our experience in cryptocurrency for many years. And you touched on a lot of different things there. It's
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, let's just start with when we're talking about the parasitical kind of relationship and back and forth. One thing in the purely L1-ish space, which you could call, Litecoin has profited probably, at least in terms of transaction volume and growth, from Bitcoin's lack of L1 scaling probably the most, because Litecoin is the number one cryptocurrency several months in a row for BitPay's payment processor statistics and has inherited a whole lot of that kind of stuff. So clearly a lot of people who would be using Bitcoin have migrated to Litecoin, but no one considers that to be L2 scaling. So I guess that begs the question, what qualifies something as an L2? Like Solana is not ETH L2. It's considered a completely separate competitor. And I guess the general point you were making there is that L2s actually tend to be that in the end, right? They tend to be actually competing blockchains. But for just the purposes of this, what makes something an L2 as opposed to just a separate L1, do you think?
I'm glad you're adding some structure to the conversation. That's much appreciated. No, I think let's start with defining what a layer two is. And I would say, it's in the name, like it's a layer two to the layer one. So it's a network built on top of of the base layer of what we know as the blockchain. Right, it's built on top. So there's some functions that are tying it into that main chain, tying its security in some way or another. And I think fundamentally, I would say that's what an L2 is. It's just a layer above a a blockchain network in its most simplistic form. And I would say, therefore, Lightning Network is a layer two. And we can break this down into further what types of layer twos there are. So, like Lightning Network is something that's based on state channels. So that's like a state channel based layer two, whereas something like optimism would be based on optimistic rollups, right? So that's or I would even consider sidechains layer twos. Actually, I know a lot of people don't actually consider sidechains layer twos, but I actually think I don't understand why we should exclude necessarily from that category. So something like Blockstream's Liquid, like that's a sidechain, right? I believe Polychain has a sidechain as well to Ethereum too. So we can break this down into all these different types of layer twos in my view.
Yeah.
But
So I guess let me hit on the like Blockstream Liquid thing for just a second, because I think that's a good example. It's primarily marketed and used as a layer two or side chain, but from my understanding, it itself is completely independent from the Bitcoin chain. So where, for example, with Lightning, everything is a two-way, it's a linked two-way payment channel ad infinitum, right, of actual Bitcoin transactions. Whereas if the Bitcoin network disappeared tomorrow, from my understanding, Liquid would still function like normal, like unabated. It would just be you obviously couldn't bridge LBTC out to BTC because there would be no BTC to bridge to. But the actual chain is completely irrespective of Bitcoin. It's not even related. So maybe something like that would be not would be considered an alt L1 as opposed to an
But
L2 or sidechain.
yeah, I mean, the definition I'm using is a very loose one, right, in terms of what is an L2. But if you think about it, something like optimism or arbitrum, for example, like these are generally considered layer twos, but there is a consensus that exists outside of the layer one itself. So in the case of a centralized sequencer, they're able to censor transactions, right? They're able to do things like double spends potentially as well within that layer two network, and they can, through the admin key, actually change the rules so that they could steal all user funds, basically. Now, are we saying, well, is optimism not a layer two? I think that's part of what layer twos are. It's like you can, they're separate networks, but there's some loose tie-in to the larger network. That I would say is what like a very loose definition is. But do you see how
Yeah.
in the liquid example and in the optimism example, they both are a case where they can just ignore the layer one if they
Yeah.
choose to?
So now with something like optimism, do transactions settle to the ETH main chain in any kind of a way?
Yes, yes, they
Yeah.
do. Yeah,
So that I guess that might be the definition that splits something like optimism from something like liquid, because liquid transactions don't ever settle to the Bitcoin main chain, only withdrawals from liquid do. And
yeah.
so in that case it's completely separate. Whereas I guess you could have optimism not settle to Ethereum, but at the present time it does, right? It's kind of what it
But I
does,
mean,
right?
but you can also settle. Yeah, right. I mean, it does settle the sequence. Interestingly enough, actually, Arbitrum doesn't do that, which is wait. Actually, no, I'm
Interesting.
sorry. I think I have it mixed up. I'm sorry. Optimism. I can't get this wrong. Optimism doesn't settle, and Arbitrum does.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the world of
Sorry,
confusing
it's one of those two. I'm
LTs.
just going to go by that because I don't want to say anything inaccurate here.
Yeah, and so what exactly is a so we have like side chains, right, and things like that. Now, what exactly is a roll up? I've heard this term a bunch of different times. I think I conceptually get what it's supposed to be, but what technically makes something a roll up?
I mean, the idea is like, I'm going to use the language in a funny way. I'll just say you basically roll up all the transactions, and then you can take the sum of those transactions and have a very small proof, and then you post that proof on the layer one blockchain. And thereby you can roll up, say, many transactions, figuratively speaking, into one. So that would be a kind of basic way to explain how a roll up works. And actually, it's interesting, this distinction. So I've been very gun ho against L2 scaling, right? In a lot of my content on X and a lot of the positions I've taken. And I think I've been an advocate of monolithic scaling actually ever since the block size debates
Of
in
course.
Bitcoin. In that sense, I've been very consistent. But I think the problem is, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there a little bit.
Yeah, no problem. There's
Yeah,
there's millions of ways this kind of could go.
yeah.
So, as far as like we have roll ups, the other thing we hear a lot, I hear, is enshrined roll ups as kind of a difference from just
Thank
roll
you.
ups. So it seems like
That's where I was
from
going, actually.
yes. All right. So go ahead on that one then.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you. So basically, so for me, there's the definitions here and the nuance is very important because for me, I'm very much against what's known as layer two scaling. I'm very much against that idea. I think that's really an anima to what we need to achieve here. On the other hand, enshrined rollups is a very different take on it. So I think structurally speaking, if you compare something that I do advocate for, which is sharding and enshrined rollups, I would actually say that
Mm-hmm.
a method of scaling a blockchain using enshrined rollups is actually more similar to a monolithic sharded blockchain than it is a quote unquote layer two scaling approach. And I think
Mm-hmm.
that's because the rollups themselves, right, become part of the layer one consensus completely because they're quote
Mm-hmm.
unquote enshrined or quote unquote based. And that I think is a very powerful technology as well because it comes with certain benefits in terms of that compression that takes place.
Yeah. So that's kind of a sort of a rough overview of some of the more popular things that people do for L2 scaling, whether it's, a side chain, whether it's just like a basic sort of a roll up, whether it's an enshrined roll up, which kind of dips into the L1 scaling kind of thing. But let's hit on the L1 scaling kind of a thing. So I don't think anyone in the world, well, publicly at least, just doesn't like L1 scale, just doesn't think you should have more capacity on chain. I don't think anyone doesn't like that. Everyone who does not advocate for L1 scaling argues that the cost is too great, that the trade offs are too great. Meaning, if you have a massive scaling on chain, what you will have are a bunch of decentralization, especially trade offs. Maybe cost, that's one thing that gets thrown out there too. Maybe it just technically is infeasible. That's another thing that's been thrown out. But the biggest thing seems to be decentralization because too few, the narrative goes at least, too few nodes or validators or whatever will be able to be run. It'll be too expensive, so it'll be too few of them, and they'll be able to be easily co-opted by outside forces, or just it will be just a couple of entities running the entire network, and we end back up with a completely centralized system, which cryptocurrency and blockchain tech is supposed to avoid as a whole. So, what are there these sorts of trade-offs for scaling on chain massively? Like, are there any real trade-offs, or what are the kind of limitations of that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it also cuts to the heart of the issue in many ways, because I think any very any at least consistent researchers that are looking into and really supporting L2 scaling, I would say pretty evenly across the board, that is their position that you've accurately steelmanned. As a matter of
Mm-hmm.
fact, that actually the trade-offs for layer one scaling are too great, and actually if that were true, if it
Mm-hmm.
was true that we just cannot scale the layer one while preserving decentralization, right? That all important quality, then I would agree with them. I would actually
Mm-hmm.
say yes, that they're actually correct. That actually layer two scaling must be the way. This is the compromise we must make because there is no other way. And and I think that is the flawed assumption that they have, this entire reverse pyramid built upon, which is
Mm-hmm.
that the layer one can't scale while preserving decentralization. And I think that is one of the most important things to realize. When Vitalik first wrote about the blockchain trilemma, and in the
Mm-hmm.
original essay, I think it was in 2013, if I'm not mistaken, or 14, I don't remember exactly. But that's when he, I think, popularized the term. He talked about the blockchain dilemma as a classical dilemma that traditional blockchain design was not able to overcome. That on the pyramid of decentralization, security, and scalability, that you had to
Mm-hmm.
be somewhere else on that pyramid and you had to make these trade-offs. But he was talking about conventional blockchain designs, not what else is possible with unconventional scaling designs. And that's exactly why Ethereum for all those years worked on sharding, because that could potentially, solve the blockchain trilemma. And I believe, it has been solved actually today. I think that when we're talking about Turing complete blockchains, I think that sharding them, right, that provides a sufficient scalability up to,
Mm-hmm.
theoretically up to 1 million TPS, which is very much needed if you think about things like DeFi and all these types of things. And when we're talking about non-Turing complete blockchains, I think they're also actually trivial to scale. That would include Bitcoin, for example, as well. But there's other reasons why it's not scaling, and that comes more down to political
Politics.
reasons and perverse, exactly, politics. That does come down to politics. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems like to kind of encapsulate the issue, you can scale like a very limited, like a payments chain on chain without too many decentralization trade offs, without anything special, just because of the kinds of data that the low level of data that's kind of sent through. But if you do want to scale something like a virtual machine or something like that that does much more complicated things, then you're probably going to want to do sharding. So it seems like sharding is kind of the just like raise the block size is kind of like the big blocker. Just how do you process a million payments on L1? The way you do that, the buzzword, the whatever concept is sharding. So really quick, would you mind, I don't think I understand sharding pretty well, but would you mind for the listeners breaking down really quick what sharding is?
No, and I want to expand on that a little bit as well and kind of paint a bit of a picture in terms of the scaling landscape, or at least from my view, in terms of what I think are good, viable methods to scale. I will also add parallelization being very important as well, and I think sharded blockchain should also be parallelized to really increase the to increase their capability, right? Per individual shard as well, and enshrined rollups, as I mentioned, which in my view I think is very similar to shard. So sharding, in a nutshell, is if you think about, as you say, just increase the block size, right? Or in the case of something like Solana, which does have fairly high node requirements, or something like BSV, where they try to push it, say, to the extreme. If I use those two examples from,
Yeah, of course.
different generations. I think there it's like you eventually do end up with some trade-offs in terms of like you're just pushing more and more, and the size of the computer you need to run becomes bigger and bigger, and that needs to be balanced in terms of like, well, are you going to have sufficient decentralization? Obviously, if you need $100,000 or $1 million supercomputer to run a node, then obviously that's going to negatively impact decentralization. And I think that has to be balanced with the capacity that you get for that trade-off. So I think that's very important to keep in mind. And we're sharding, and that's also known as quadratic scaling, in that the idea is that the larger the network becomes, the more expensive and more expensive, and it doesn't scale in like a linear way in terms of you add more capacity. It doesn't become twice as expensive. It becomes like 10 times more expensive at a certain point. And that's that kind of exponential threshold that you hit with these systems. Like there's just a physical limit to how big we can build computers, and in terms of the economics as well. And what sharding does, and this is very important, sharding is able to break up the workload between multiple computers. So you could say have 100 transactions taking care of the network. In a non-sharded design, your single node needs to process those 100 transactions, right? In a sharded design, you could say you have 4 shards, and then each node processes 25 transactions. And that by breaking up the workload, you lower the node requirements while simultaneously increasing total capacity. And because this is all part of a single network, it's all quote unquote enshrined, it doesn't come with the same trade-offs in terms of interoperability and a sacrifice of composability. And that is where there's a big difference with sharded systems, and that's where sharding really comes into its own, I think, in my view. And I put enshrined rollups in a very similar category if you design the layer one with that kind of layout in mind. So you'd have, say, 100 enshrined rollups, and then usage is spread between them, and you have a native interoperability protocol, and that makes it all seamless. That makes it all part of a coherent whole.
Yeah, so with sharding, essentially, the workload is split amongst, let's just say, 4, right? Let's just say divided by 4, because why not? 4 different shards that then would process instead of just one, but then they all end up being put back into the exact same chain. So it's still, if you were looking at a block explorer, at like a history of the chain, it could appear as if there was no sharding, right? As in it's just a linear, like a linear kind of sequence of blocks and stuff. So now, usually when you shard, does that mean that the history of the blockchain is not necessarily sharded? The actual disk space is not sharded. So even though the in real time the transactions are processed, are split up, the processing is split up. At the end of the day, all nodes still need that big copy of the blockchain, right?
Nodes won't need the entire copy of the blockchain, because a lot of it will be pruned. You don't need to know what happened five years ago, for instance. If and that's how most pools operate today. They're pruned up to a point. You'd have archival nodes that would store the whole data for other purposes. But what would happen is, as the validators, as the stakers in this case, would switch between shards, they have to then upload the state of that shard over, say, X amount of blocks. So that way they can independently verify each shard each time, and it's random. That's very important to understand. A major criticism of sharding is like, oh, but you're splitting up security when you do that, and then one shard is easier to attack than one whole blockchain. And I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of how sharding works, because of validator randomization. Is that you can't, as a validator, as a staker, you don't get to choose what shard you end up on. You get randomly assigned, and that means that in order to attack, a single shard, you literally need to attack the entire network, basically. So it still keeps things like 51%, thresholds intact in that sense.
Yeah.
And
So
that, I
sort of.
think, is very important to understand that as well.
Yeah. So I guess the criticism of split security sort of sounds like saying you can attack a single mining pool in Bitcoin and then censor transactions, which you could try, but they still end up. You cannot determine which mining pool is the one discovering which blocks. It's kind of a very similar corollary, right?
Yeah. That's there's a similar analogy. I would say it's even stronger in the case of sharding, because like the shards are not pools, which in Bitcoin case are these centralized companies, right? In most cases, whereas the shards are actually these kind of, these protocol constructs that are part of the layer one. And the really exciting thing about this, and this is what Ethereum was working on for these years, which is why when they pivoted, my support started pivoting as well, is that we're at a point now where we actually have sharded blockchains. We actually have blockchains that can do 100,000 TPS today. And theoretically, because the way these blockchains work, theoretically, if they need to, they can increase the number of shards. And now we're talking about a capacity exceeding 1 million TPS. So for me, that's so exciting as a blockchain advocate, as a believer in this movement. That's like the holy grail for me, in terms
Yeah.
of blockchain technology and scalability. And yeah.
Yeah. And so enshrined rollups are definitely not the same thing, but they could achieve similar-ish results in that instead you have a different chain that's completely separate from the main chain that's running, is my understanding. Feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, of course.
I think I'll already correct you if you don't mind.
Yes, go for it.
I would say the enshrined rollups are part of the main chain, similar to how all shards are part of a coherent whole in that system. So in enshrined rollups, you can really think of them as shards in many ways. The big difference really is just being rolled up. So it's the same set of validators. It's the layer one validators that will be responsible for sequencing and will be responsible for, the chain's security and the chain's rules, which means it's all just part of the same layer one. And it just, to me, seems like it's just a more efficient form of sharding, because you're rolling up transactions in the way that we described before.
Yeah, and so the same L1 validators are actually processing all the individual transactions before they're rolled up as well.
Correct. Yeah. That
Yeah,
potentially gives some speed advantages too.
yeah, and so as they're doing that, it ends up being similar to sharding, except that you don't have that entire like data storage and blockchain history. It's kind of, you have a truncated history. It's almost
Correct.
like, yeah, it's like an
Yeah.
abbreviated version of sharding, sort of.
Which is why I'm a little bit conflicted about it, but then I'm getting a bit too deep in the weeds when it comes to talking about lost history and roll-ups
Yeah.
versus pure sharded systems. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is kind of the way Mimblewimble works, from my understanding. Is it doesn't keep transaction history as a whole. Just keeps a kernel of the current state, the compounded state of the chain, and so it could be kind of analogous to that. And of course, some people don't like you know that sort of approach, but it
Yeah.
does work in its own way.
Yeah.
And
That
so
makes more sense.
as far as that's enshrined rollups. So if you had, I guess, unenshrined rollups, or whatever the term would be for regular meat and potatoes rollups, or whatever you want to call them, in that case, what you'd have is an L2, a different validator set, right? Not the L1 validator set processing. Again, I could be completely wrong, so feel free to correct me, right?
No, that's
But
correct.
in which case, it's a different set of validators that are processing all the transactions, and then they sequence them to the main chain, or is it still the L1 that then does the sequencing at the end? And then, but basically, where's the sequencing come in for that?
So it depends on which layer two we're specifically talking about, obviously, in this case. But in most, say, Ethereum layer twos, they operate on a centralized sequencer. And this would be also a good segue to talk about shared sequencing. I'm not sure if you've been following the discussion about that, but
Yeah.
that's been really interesting as well.
Let me check the note real quick just to make sure. You know, yeah. So as far as decentralized and shared sequencers, so from my understanding, a lot of sequencing, which is the process of packaging all that up and putting it onto the main chain, is in a lot of cases is centralized. Can you name some of the projects that do a centralized sequencing?
Yeah. Optimism, Arbitrum, ZK Sync, Base, all the big ones are doing centralized sequencing. And you basically have a, proof of authority system, if you will, that's deciding on this. And, people say, well, it's fine because they can only censor transactions, or deny you access completely. But I would view that as being very antithetical and not at all something that I would consider equivalent to, what is the layer one experience, where it's censorship resistant and where no one can come along and say, no, you can't use this, right? The defense
Of
is like, oh,
course.
well, just go somewhere else then. But you know what? Then we're just back to square one. Then it feels very similar to a world like banks and financial institutions,
Yeah.
where you
Choose
have
your own
all of
bank.
these. Yeah, and that's what it is, right? It's fragmentation. That's maybe an important key word to bring up here, because all of this is creating fragmentation across the layer twos. There is no shared sequencer. That is not possible. That's part of the problem. So part of the reason why I'm such a big advocate of layer one scaling, even though maybe to a layman they're like, well, I don't care, what is the difference, is that in one system it becomes fragmented, and you end up having all these competing things fighting each other, and no one can agree on the same protocols, and it just becomes a UX nightmare. But in a layer one scaled system, it just works. You can just use it. And I think that is the big difference. There is one major trade-off though when we're talking about sharding, is that it does add a few second delay to confirmation times with cross shard communication.
Yeah. Like how many
Yeah,
seconds are we talking about typically?
like 1 or 2 seconds. I don't think it's the end of the world.
Yeah. I mean, if you're talking like my number one experience and all that is, of course, like the payments use case. And if it's 1 to 2 seconds is what it takes for payment, and then you add on a 2 to 3, you
Right.
notice it, but it's not going to destroy it. But
But
outside
but
of the
hold on.
payments use case, yeah.
But hold on. This is confirmation time, right?
Yeah.
If you paid somewhere using Bitcoin, you don't wait 10 minutes or 30 minutes or an hour until a block is confirmed, right? So from that perspective, considering that the network is not like congested, I actually think that is an okay trade-off, because it's not, you don't need instant confirmation in these settings. Yeah.
Yeah. So as far as like the latency provided by sharding, it's nothing special. But especially I would say compared with the latency of trying to settle an L2 onto an L1, it's a very different latency
Oh yeah.
trade off. You know.
No, I mean, then it's worse, right? But that's one of the advantages, something like parallelization. That's one of the major advantages. If you're saying, no, we're not sharding, we're just utilizing parallelization, and we're just doing really, core to the middle kind of technology to get a single chain speeds as high as we can. That's one of the advantages, because now you don't have that few second delay. Now you can get it down to, half a second, quarter of a second in terms of confirmation times. And that's something like, that's the Solanas and the Suis and the Aptoses of this world that are pursuing that route. But I do think there is you do hit a limit at a certain point in terms of how big of a machine you can build. And you can say, well, Moore's law, in a few years that won't even matter as much anymore, and that's not completely wrong either. Uh, but I do really like the idea of having a million TPS. That's the kind of thing that gets me excited.
Yeah, of course. Now, so to sort of finish on the sequencer kind of subject. So
Oh
most
yes.
major sequencers to get today are kind of centralized permission, proof of authority, etc. So I've heard the terms either a decentralized sequencer or a shared sequencer across L2s thrown about. Do you mind touching on those two concepts?
Yeah, yeah. Um, I'm going to expand out a bit, and then I'll zoom into the sequencer specifically. So there's a few issues with layer twos. It's not just the sequencer. So you also have most layer twos are based on a smart contract that are on the layer one that define the rules of that layer two, and they're able to change those contract rules and thereby undermining the entire thing. And so that allows them to steal user funds. The sequencer specifically is another entity that exists outside of the layer one, and this entity in particular is able to determine the sequence of transactions, and this is where MEV, minor extractable value, comes from as well, because they can determine that. So that's why there's also more value in sequencing for that reason as well. And they're able to collect fees in many cases. So this exists there. And the thing is everything okay?
Yeah, everything's good.
Cool. And the thing is, what's been very interesting, like most recently, in the layer two scaling world, and this has been one of the most exciting developments, I would say. There's been some prominent podcast where Justin Drake in particular has been talking a lot about shared sequencing. And this conversation is particularly interesting because it is an acknowledgement of the critique that I've been making all of these years, that layer two, quote unquote, layer two scaling causes fragmentation. Right? It's a validation of that critique, and that, I think, is a very powerful development. And they're saying shared sequencing can be a solution to that problem. And the basic
Okay.
idea is we're going to get everyone to agree. We're going to get optimism to agree. We're going to get arbitrum to agree. We're going to get
We were
right.
just in the middle of a nice chat about shared sequencing, and you mentioned about getting all the different L2s to agree to use the same sequencer. That's where we
Yeah.
left off.
Yeah. So the plan is, and I think, or the suggestion is, and this is what Justin Drake has been pushing for among with some other core developers, and there's something I do appreciate, because within that does lie an acknowledgement of the problem.
Yeah,
That's
of
that
course.
problem of fragmentation that I'm referring to. I think that's very important that we've come to that stage. But the solution is enshrining the sequencer on the layer one, so that all of the different layer twos can all use a shared sequencer, so to speak. And that is, in my view, actually a step in the right direction, because it is moving more functionality to the layer one. I don't
Yeah.
think it's enough, but Also, and here comes the bigger problem that I find with all of this, I don't think that they will succeed. I think this is a massive social coordination problem, right? Where
Of course.
the incumbents actually have perverse incentives acting upon them to not use a shared sequencer. This whole idea of like, let's just get everyone to agree to all use the shared sequencer, for them to give up that power, for them to give up that control, for them to give up, those fees, for them to give up that MEV. Everyone's just going to give that up and use a shared sequencer, and we're all going to sing Kumbaya together. That's the plan. And I think it's massively underestimating human nature. I think it's massively underestimating, the free market dynamics, and the irony of this is, as this conversation is going on, you have something like Coffee saying, oh, yeah, everyone use our shared sequencer. And you have Optimism saying, yeah, everyone can use our super chain shared sequencer. And then you have Arbitrum saying, everyone can use our shared sequencer. And then you have Polygon saying, everyone can use our shared sequencer. And as long as everyone use our shared sequencer, then we'll have perfect interoperability. And everyone's just competing with each other and no one can agree. I mean, that's how the current banking system works. Blockchains solve that by having a credibly neutral layer that everyone can use.
Yeah,
And
of course.
and fundamentally, layer two, quote unquote, layer two scaling, even with an attempt to create a shared sequencer at this stage, won't work. It's not a good replacement. Now, I say at this stage because actually you do have blockchains like Polkadot and AVAX and Atom, Cosmos, who actually have a quote unquote shared sequencer in a manner of speaking, in the form of having these communication protocols that were enshrined from the beginning, that communicate between the different chains. So, like, I think that's a case where it does work. But then my criticism of those blockchains is that, well, those different parachains or subchains or whatever they're called in those systems still get to decide on their own rules. And that still does not make it equivalent to sharding. That means it still is fragmented. Things are still broken up. And that's where I just don't see it as being a good replacement for layer one scaling, even though it's a step in the right direction. I just think what Ethereum is doing now, I think their heart's in the right place, but I think it's very misguided and too hopeful, really.
Yeah, and so we're talking about shared sequencers, and a shared sequencer would just mean all the different L2s could use it to sequence to the main chain. But you could have a centralized shared sequencer, correct? Where a central entity runs it and control it and have all the awfulness of centralization, but just that a bunch of companies or L2s could use it, right? Now,
I mean, theoretically you could, but I think practically the free market basically guarantees you'd have competitors as well, just like how we have altcoins today.
yeah, of course. Now, how realistic is it to have a decentralized shared sequencer?
Well, I don't think it's realistic at all, especially in Ethereum's case, where you already have tens of billions of dollars that are staked towards
Yeah.
Optimism
How
and
about like
Base and Arbitrum.
technically, from a technically feasible?
From a technical perspective, it's perfectly feasible. This is why I think it's a trap that a lot of kind of developers would fall into, because if they look at this from a development perspective, it looks perfectly fine. And it does solve a lot of the friction points around L2 scaling. I'm absolutely willing to admit that. But the problem isn't a technological one. The problem is a social one. It's a social coordination problem. And I just do not think that you can get everyone to agree on this. And, if you read the room, if you look at some of these discussions between large layer twos, there's no way these layer twos are giving up their sequences. I think that's completely misplaced, and it's completely underestimating the power that, say, 20 billion or $100 billion has on people, which is the ridiculous amounts that are being invested into the layer two ecosystem right now.
Yeah. So what happens if what happens to all these companies, I should say, if a decentralized shared sequencer gets implemented? Like, what do they actually lose? Because if they still have their own L2s, they still have to be able to collect some sorts of fees, etc., for using the L2s, right? So what
Yeah.
is the a shared decentralized sequencer outside of their control? What does that lose them?
I would say they still keep most of the MEV. So I think I
Mm-hmm.
actually agree with Justin Drake's assessment of that ultimately, especially if you consider some future upgrades as well in Ethereum's case. I would say they lose the ability to censor. They lose
Mm-hmm.
the ability to uh, deny people access to such a system, I think. So I think that is one of the main things they lose. Do they lose fees? Maybe a small amount, but I wouldn't say it's a massive amount either. But I think it's a question of control. And I mean, that depends. There are sequences that do make a lot of money as well that are geared towards that at the same time. So
Mm-hmm.
I think you could cut it both ways. But I think you don't lose a massive amount actually, and I think Justin Drake is correct in pointing that out. But the little that they lose, the little control that they lose, the little bit of fees that they lose, I just don't think that these for-profit companies are going to do that, even if it's just from a perspective of ego. Like, you
Mm-hmm.
know, I mean, they've most of them have already committed themselves for their company's shared sequencer to be the one that everyone uses, and thereby we solve for operability. I mean, I just find it such a hilarious argument, you know, this idea of, oh no, we're all just everyone's all just going to agree to the best solutions. That's not how markets work. But
Yeah,
that
it's
seems to be the hope for a lot of these people.
so from a technical perspective, I guess let's contrast two different, for the sake of argument, Ethereum's,
Mm,
right? Ethereum with a decentralized shared sequencer and a bunch of L2s out there that still get sequenced to the main chain in a decentralized shared way, and a sharded Ethereum. What are the main differences between those two systems? Because we're already
right,
talking about, according to what we've been discussing, two things that will not happen anyway.
right.
But yeah.
No, it's interesting. And I would say if they do succeed, let's just say hypothetically, in creating a shared sequencer, then I would put Ethereum in a similar category to which I would put AVAX and Polkadot and Cosmos and these type of chains that do have a successful kind of interoperability protocol between them.
Mm-hmm.
The problem for me, the reason why I'm not satisfied with this, is because the individual chains can still decide on their own rules,
Mm-hmm.
you know. And what that means is that if I use Polkadot as an example, I actually did write about this recently. If I use Polkadot as an example, I can seamlessly interoperate between different Polkadot blockchains,
Mm-hmm.
right? But do I want to just trust every blockchain, right? The validators, the Polkadot validators, right? What their job is to make sure that the parachain follows its own rules. It
Mm-hmm.
makes sure that it follows the rules that it has made for itself.
Yeah, which means it could make some sketchy rules.
Exactly. You know, a little bit reminds me of the phrase "Who watches the watchers,"
Yeah,
and in
the
this,
watch is the watchman. I remember that.
yeah, right. And in this case, where you know what validators are doing, so hypothetically, this is how something like a Polkadot parachain might work. Hypothetically, um, say I'm interacting with blockchain with parachain A, right? And I want to transact with blockchain B, right? Then I can go boom, boom to blockchain B. However, blockchain B decides to say, I'm going to steal this user's funds. I'm going to change the rules to steal a user's funds. Now, when the validators, the layer one validators look at that and they go, okay, is he following the rules? The rules say that this parachain is stealing the user's funds. Okay, that is
Mm-hmm.
valid. We're going to confirm this. And then that's what happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
To me, and whoever gets to decide that is the parachain itself. And they could be a proof of authority system. They could be a federated system. They could have a smaller decentralized consensus, right? There's a whole spectrum there. And I think that is a major problem in terms of is it seamless now? If that's a possibility, can I just blindly use any parachain? No, that would be irresponsible. So it's that stage you need to reintroduce user choice. And
Yeah,
I
of
think it's that
course.
user choice, which is what creates the fragmentation, and that what also interferes with the user experience.
Yeah, and so all this discussion seems to sort of highlight that there's some serious problems and complexity and trust trade offs and all kinds of things that are created from this sort of approach of L2 scaling, which was done in the name of decentralization, of basically, it seems like there's a lot of like penny wise, pound foolish sort of things going on here. But at the same time, it's undeniable that in this roughly 15-year-old, $2.5 trillion space, the vast majority, I don't know if I'd say vast, but at least super majority, at least like clear majority of everything, whether it's attention, whether it's capital, whether it's probably, all of that stuff seems to be going in this, what maybe we're discussing is a wrong direction, right? So now it might seem to be a proof of an appeal to authority fallacy right here, or whatever. Like, well, all the experts are saying this. The consensus of experts are saying this. It can't be wrong, can it? But it's at the same time as it's a consensus of capital, which is where the free market is never, I'd say never wrong, but on the whole, the free market does allow for a system where the best rise to the top. And it seems like this is rising to the top currently in this 15-year snapshot of this industry.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think that is if it's not maybe the best approach?
I mean, so is Dogecoin right now rising, outperforming
Another
everything else.
fantastic question.
I think there is maybe a reason for it, and I think there's a reason why it's repeating, which is that L1 scaling does not allow you to rent seek on layer one functions. Layer two scaling allows you to set up systems as VCs that can effectively capitalize, can effectively profit from, say, this layer two scaling, right? Like how, I mean, that I think that is a very important, distinction to keep in mind, because that's something that I see occurring time and time again. Like, how do you make money off this thing if you're a layer one developer? Like, how much
Yeah.
money are you going to make doing that? Getting paid, a wage by the Ethereum Foundation, or, you can get a token allocation from, Optimism, or, and work over there and become a multi-millionaire within a few months. That's, it's a very tempting direction for things to go in. And I think misallocation, it wouldn't be the first time that a lot of misallocation of capital and perverse incentives leads to a situation where a lot of human beings are just wrong. I mean, it happens all the time in history where, we do the wrong thing. It took a world war to stop the Nazis. Was that entire country of experts and people that were highly esteemed, were they all wrong? Was that entire country wrong? The entire government of Germany, were they all wrong? Yes, they were. And I think that's just this peculiarity of human nature that props its ugly head up a lot of the time. This is why we still see pseudoscience, because of political influence. This is why we see so much nonsense in cryptocurrency. But look, it's also early, and there's a severe lack of understanding of what these systems are and should be. I mean, these are living experiments, and we're
Yeah, of
learning
course.
from that. And I think not everyone's at the same stage of development when it comes to learning about where things are. Like you correctly pointed out at the beginning of this discussion, I think a lot of people don't even know that Ethereum is not scaling its layer one, because so many influencers just repeat blindly that, Ethereum is scaling and Ethereum is going to have million of TPS capacity. But no, that's all just broken up in these other chains. Are you an Arbitrum user? Are you an Optimism user? Are you a Base user? Are you really an Ethereum user? I
No,
think
I'm a
there's
Polygon user, unfortunately.
well,
Rarely, but still.
You're at the mercy of their admin keys there too,
Yeah, of course.
which
Yeah.
is wild.
Well, so as far as this L2 scaling, it seems like L2 versus L1 type thing. The entire discussion seems to focus on a monolithic use case scaling, as in the stuff that the chain does that should absolutely be on L1 or it absolutely cannot be on L1. It has to be on L2. But what do you think of the use cases of L2s for not general purpose scaling, but for very specific use cases? So, like, let's just say the average Ethereum user, in the future, sharded Ethereum, whatever, uses the main sharded chain, etc. Everything works fine. But then there's this crazy game off on the side that is very popular, but still is a niche use case, maybe. And that runs on an L2 with a sequencer and all this kind of stuff. So, what do you think of those kinds of things? Do you think there are some good applications for L2s that just aren't for general purpose scaling?
Definitely. No, I think there's multiple, like a game potentially, as you describe, or potentially a DEX that's very high volume and needs to be very fast. For example, maybe even streaming services where you want to say pay per second, and you kind of abstract things away, and where you already have some sort of relationship with another service. Maybe you'd use their layer two. I think all of that makes perfect sense, actually. But I do think these are niches. I think the vast majority of usage can be encompassed by the layer one, which is why if Ethereum scaled tomorrow, which I actually believe it could, well, maybe within a week, if the Ethereum developers just, decided to, which should tell you something about the decentralization and governance of Ethereum as well. But that's maybe it's a little bit too much to get into now. If they scaled Ethereum like within a week, things like arbitrism and optimism, like, I just think a lot of that value would tank because it's based on the speculation that all of that value is going to get swallowed up by layer twos. But what if the layer one scales? If the layer one scales, then you don't need arbitrism and optimism. You only need it for these niche use cases, as we pointed out, which I think are great. And I have nothing against those, but I think there's a big difference between these two. And I think it's really become like this constricting thing where like blockchains are being squeezed to death by layer two influencers that are choking it out so they can't breathe. This was always the old joke, right? Among the in the block size debates that Blockstream, that the company paying off developers promoting layer twos were
Block the stream.
blocking the stream. Exactly.
Yes.
Like the irony of people choosing that name. And I think, that the group responsible being called Core was also, I think, a kind of a very self-aware choice by Satoshi, who coined that for the lead development client, So yeah, I mean, look, I'm obviously a critic on X and a lot of these different things, but at heart, I'm actually an optimist. I actually think that this is all part of the growing pains, and we need to learn things the hard way sometimes in history, and sometimes we need to repeat our mistakes a few times before we really, really learn them. And I think a lot of the story of Bitcoin's block size debates, I think it's been rewritten. A lot of times it's been interpreted in different ways. I'm not a fan of, I think, a lot of how a lot of people look back at it. I've always been meaning to write something about that. Maybe I'll get back to that one day. And I think that comes with the consequence as well of saying, hey, but Bitcoin is great, so let's follow the Bitcoin way of doing things. And I think that's somewhat infected Ethereum. And I think Bitcoin was a beautiful invention, was this beautiful thing that came along and really has changed the world for the better. And then the next iteration was Ethereum, which was more scalable at the time and was promising massive scale and was more programmable, right? But then that gets stuck. And then we go with the third iteration, which is something that also has programmability, but actually pursues sharding. And you know what? There'll probably be a fourth iteration after that as well. But there is progress in that evolution. And I think it's pretty volatile. It's not what I think a lot of Bitcoin maxis would prefer, which is this idea of like a perfect cryptocurrency asset that never needs to change. That's just, et cetera, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera. But that's just not the reality of our situation. It's not all roses and sunshine, but that is a wild journey to be on. And that is, I think, at least for me, that is a fascinating space. That's at least not boring. That's at least keeps me interested and stimulated through
Yeah.
that roller coaster.
Well, so kind of a final sort of question on this is what could happen that could make you change your mind on L2 scaling? And obviously, we're talking like a technical perspective, right? And so it seems like one part of that might that it's an improvement at least is the shared decentralized sequencer. But what other kinds of things would have to be developed that would make you feel comfortable saying, maybe it's not my first choice, but this is more than okay. This is a fun, great way of doing things.
Yeah. Um, I want to say enshrined rollups or enshrined layer twos, but I think at that point it's not layer two scaling. So I don't think that's a
Mm-hmm.
fair way for me to answer it. Um, I'll put it this way. I'll put it in terms of putting principles first, an objective first approach,
Mm-hmm.
which would be a completely seamless UX for the user without any UX trust trade-offs, without any security trade-offs. Like it just works seamlessly, and million plus TPS, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
100,000 TPS plus, whatever. I think if that can be achieved, then yeah, I would change my mind. Now, how would that be achieved? The only scenario that I could think of that I've heard of described in which that would be achieved, maybe there's more. I'll think about that. But one scenario is that I think, I'm sorry, I'm going to do my best to steel man this, but that everyone chooses to use a single layer two.
Mm-hmm.
So we have a layer one blockchain, and then we have a layer two blockchain. I'm stretching imagination here, but everyone chooses to use that same layer two. So it's completely interoperable because everyone's just on the same layer two. The irony is that if you could do that with a layer two, why didn't you just do that with the layer one in the first place? So
Yeah.
it's kind of ridiculous if you think about it. But under that scenario, it'd be like, okay, this is ridiculous, but I guess it works. Okay. Um,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
actually, in because I was criticizing Polkadot before, they had something interesting as well, which is I think they're calling it oh man, yeah, they're calling it accords. So remember the
Mm-hmm.
problem I was talking about. So if you achieve shared sequencing, but then if you can also achieve, as far as I understand it, accords allow, say you have 10 parachains, and you
Mm-hmm.
say, okay, with these 10 parachains, they're all going to agree stealing user funds is not okay. So no
Mm-hmm.
matter what, we will not confirm your transaction if it's stealing user funds.
Mm.
That would be an accord. So if you could kind of enshrine an accord to the point where like that would be sufficient, and that
Mm-hmm.
also runs into this shared sequencer problem. Like, why would everyone just agree to that thing? Like, it doesn't. But to Steelman, there's an interesting angle there, and I think Polkadot is doing really interesting research from that perspective. However, all of that is very speculative, and has some major social coordination problems, all while layer one scaling is here today, ready for adoption. So yeah, that
Yeah.
that makes me a layer one scaling advocate. And those scenarios that I described, I just don't find them very likely. But those are two scenarios in which I would say, yeah, and I would shrug my shoulders and go, okay, great. I guess we got freedom money for the world now. I mean, how could I complain about that, right?
Yeah. So basically, it would be shared decentralized sequencer and some kind of a minimum share, like accord across
Yes, yes.
L2s that.
It'd have to be an enshrined accord. And then like basically you'd have an ecosystem that would kind of coalesce around that on some level. I wonder if
Mhm.
that's possibly a direction that layer two researchers will go to in the future. And maybe what Polkadot is doing is potentially they're on the cutting edge potentially, I suspect, on these some of these ideas. So
Yeah, and there is a, I guess, a politically feasible path to some of this. Maybe depends on not today, but this in the hypothetical world where a high-powered L1, let's just say Solana, for example,
mhm.
is starting to actually eat Ethereum's lunch, not just nibble at the crumbs, but
Yeah,
like really eat into it. And at that point, rather than just switch to Solana, there might still be some coin distribution issues or some centralization concerns or whatever that would make people grudgingly switch to Solana. So Ethereum still has a viable path forward, in which case maybe they'll say, okay, listen, L2s, you're going to lose everything if we don't do something. So you're going to have to compromise a little bit. You could still have your L2s, you can still do this, but you all have to conform to not only the shared sequencer, but the enshrined accords as well of minimum things. Everything else, all that other stuff, you can still keep yourselves. But I understand you don't want to do this, you don't want to socially coordinate, but you're going to lose everything. And maybe in that point, then Ethereum, in this imperfect solution, but solution nonetheless, for example, could continue to limp onwards. I don't know.
it would also require something like Base, the Coinbase's layer twos, to actually allow sanctioned transactions.
Yeah, won't that be fun?
I mean, I don't think Coinbase would do that. You
I
know,
don't think they could do that without the legal repercussions from state actors, et cetera, on the company Coinbase, you know?
yeah, and that's just one example where you have these divergent interests and priorities. You know, they could say, "Oh, we're moving it to the layer one, and therefore it's not up to us anymore." But how will a judge interpret that? That's yeah. I I I'm very skeptical. It's this the thing about layer one scaling is if the thing just works, if you have a base layer that provides block space for everyone to use, right? Then we can all coalesce around that. We can all have our shelling point. We can all build our businesses and our applications and our dApps and our DAOs. We can all build it in this shared space that works as a coherent whole. Like that is, I think, what we should be aiming for. And I think fundamentally speaking, these varied ecosystems, they're not all going to agree on the same protocols. You know, it's kind of like Maxi saying, oh, well, everyone's just going to all agree to use Bitcoin and there won't be any altcoins anymore. You know, it kind of reminds me of that mentality where Bitcoiners have told me this unironically. And I think it's this deep kind of wishful thinking, that is the undercurrent there, where I just do not think that is a viable path forward. I mean, every good hypothesis needs conditions upon which they're proven wrong. So when you asked me that question, I had to come up with something. So for now, that's my best steelman defense. But very much you run into this social coordination problem. Very much the same thing you see with financial institutions and banks today. It's not that different. It's not that different.
Yeah, and it's just a little side experience thing. So I've been experimenting with some like payments tech and things like that. And I have a watch for NFC payments. And for the longest time, the watch would work everywhere that, say, a Google Wallet would work, except Google Wallet would work everywhere, but the watch would not work at Square point of sale systems, just the watch. And Square officially told me that they hadn't yet supported it. And just like the morass of different banks and providers that I could map out that I have way too much knowledge on because of, what I do for work, right? It's pretty insane. And so I definitely see that. And we're seeing elements of that in the crypto world where human nature has not changed. And so hopefully we get to coalesce around a lot of different standards and payment standards and things like that. But also, in the meantime, it definitely helps to have a unified messaging front as far as what we're trying to achieve. Yeah, well, this has been a fantastic chat. What else would you like people to know, and where else would you like people to be directed?
Sure. No, you can check me out on Twitter, on X, where you can just look up my name, Justin Bonds. I write articles on Medium. I have a podcast now, the Bonds Review, which I have nowhere near the frequency that you do in terms of your release schedule, but that's also something I'm doing. So people should definitely watch your show while they wait a month at a time between my episodes.
Monthly is good.
Oh no, monthly is actually rather ambitious, but I yeah, I think we have to ask ourselves what we're here for. Look at first
Mm-hmm.
principles. I think you and me were both here also for the freedom of it and for the vision of what
Mm-hmm.
cryptocurrency brings. And I think we can only really empower people. And the best way to empower people is to give people all of the um, all of the strength that a layer one, that a blockchain provides. Give them
Mm-hmm.
all of that. Just your everyday people, your guy on the street, your poor guy in the developing world, your elite banker, you all have access to the same protocol because it's cheap, fast, and easy and has tons of capacity. Like that is empowering. And I think on so many levels, what quote unquote layer two scaling leads to is it's turning people into second class citizens. It means, oh yeah, the bank gets to settle on this higher tier system while you get less guarantees and less
Mm-hmm.
security. And I don't think that that's right, especially in the face that, you know what, we can scale the layer one. It's completely viable. It's
Mm-hmm.
multiple chains that are doing it through various methods. It's just it just strikes me as a surrender as well. You know, if you say, oh no, we're doing
Absolutely.
layer two scaling now, you know, why don't you just do your best to scale the layer one and let layer twos just do their thing naturally? Don't
Mm-hmm.
restrict the layer one. And I think that's what we're seeing. And that's been tragic. But obviously for well-informed investors, you know, one person's tragedy, you can turn that into opportunity as well. And that's, you know, part of my business as well at Cyber Capital. So if you want to invest in a contrarian, then our doors are open for that too. And yeah, I would say don't follow the advice of every influencer, and that includes me.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of weirdness in cryptocurrency, and I just recommend people to learn and study. Yeah.
Are you saying don't trust, verify? That's crazy
Yes.
talking these days.
Crazy, right? Madness.
All right. Well, thanks very much for everyone for watching, and thanks Justin for being on. And I'll see you guys in the next one.